to see each of you this evening. We're glad to have you. If you're a visitor with us, thank you for coming, and we hope you'll enjoy being together with the saints to worship and serve God. I'll be in this lesson tonight. I will be repeating the idea that concerns the actions of those who are referred to in the Bible as fools. I'm going to preach this with the awareness in my heart that Jesus made it very clear that everyone, in Matthew 5, verse 22, everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Whoever says to his brother, "You are good for nothing," shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, "You fool," shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. That's pretty serious business. According to that warning, as a follower of Jesus Christ, you and I have to be real careful about what we say and not saying anything that refers to people out of anger as fools. It's going to be my purpose in the nature of this lesson tonight is to think about what we might call the hard truth about the idea of being a fool. I want you to pay special attention to that. I want you to think about the things we'll be talking about because the Bible gives us great warnings, serious warnings about conduct that's very foolish that we have to give attention to. You know, one of my concerns, and I'm not predicting anything bad, but one of my concerns about mankind is I just feel like we're in a time where people are getting infected with the spirit of fools, and we don't want to be caught up in that culture. We don't want to fall victim to what they're pushing upon us. I don't want to be a fool. I don't want you to be a fool, and I don't want to in any way be a victim of a fool. I think we have to be careful about all of that. One of the things we understand about the way a fool acts is that the Bible teaches about their tendency to reject Almighty God. And that's where we're going to start this evening. You're probably going to be familiar almost immediately with the passage I'll be talking to. But what you find out is the rejection of God is one of the earmarked values of a fool. It's one of the things you can point to and say that person is foolish because they absolutely reject Almighty God. We want to think about that. You know, I don't want to make a joke about it, but I would have you to stop and think. Do you remember that little toy we let our kids play with? It was after my day, but we let our kids play with when they were growing up, and you pulled a string on it. It was called a see and say. You pulled that string, and it'd say, the cow says moo, or the cow, or the horse says neigh, or whatever. I remember that toy. If you had a version of it that said fooled in the bottom right-hand corner, and you pulled it on that spot, the fool would have something to say. The fool would say, "There is no God." That would be the theme of the fool. That would be the idea behind it. Matter of fact, that's not the only time the Psalm says that. In Psalm 53, verse 1, that was Psalm 14, verse 1. In Psalm 53, verse 1, it repeats the same thing. And I think any of us would be appalled if we pulled the see and say and it says, the fool says, "There's no God." But that's a reality. That is what the fool says, and that is God's version of it. When you look in the text, Psalm 14 goes on to say a little bit more, some other things that we need to know about the fool. Look at this with me. Psalm 14, verses 2 and 3. He will go on to say, "They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is no one among them who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the sons of men to see if they understand who is seeking after God. They've all turned aside." That's because of their loss of belief in God. "Together, they've all become corrupt. There's not one that does good, not even one." And you might be interested to know that Paul quotes from that in Romans chapter 3, pretty substantial section over it. All of this could rightly be described as practical atheism. it doesn't necessarily mean that they absolutely out and out go on campaigns denying God, just absolutely really come down hard on, I don't believe in God or whatever. Practical atheism looks at God like he really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what he does. It makes no effect on me. It kind of reminds me of Titus chapter 1, verse 16, when it says they profess God, they profess that they know God, but in works they deny him, being abominable and disobedient, and unto every good work they are reprobate. If you begin to look at some of the things the Bible has to say, fools operate by what could rightly be called naturalism. Naturalism is the opposite of spirituality. It's the idea that we just learn what we learn by nature itself. We learn what we learn by natural things of life. And it shuns the idea that God would reveal certain truths. In all of that, you understand that is a poor choice in life to operate that way. Let me show you certain passages. Like in Psalm 92, verses 5 through 6, O Lord, how great are your works! Your thoughts are very deep. But listen to him now. He says, a senseless man does not know, nor does a fool understand this. God has revealed his works, but a senseless man won't think it through. The senseless man won't consider his works before God. There's another passage like that one, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14. Paul is writing, he says, a natural man, that's the man that doesn't think from a spiritual perspective. A natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him. He cannot understand them because they are spiritually appraised. They have a spiritual value to them, and he rejects all of that. And another passage like it's Romans chapter 8, verse 7, it says, because the mind set on the flesh is hostile towards God. Hope you're not that way this evening. A mind set on the flesh is hostile towards God. Go listen to what else it says. It does not subject itself to the law of God, nor is it even able to. Has no spiritual value within him. He can't appreciate anything spiritual, can't turn around and grasp anything out of all of that. Okay, the next big thing I want you to understand about a fool, there's going to be 6 things. The second thing I want you to understand is that another hard truth about fools, God is going to give them over to a depraved mind. Let us look over here in Romans chapter 1. I told you a minute ago that Romans chapter 3 actually quotes some of these scriptures. Romans chapter 1 is talking about these very things. Now listen to how Paul explains this. He says, for even though they knew God, but this is that practical atheism I'm talking about. Even though they knew God, they didn't honor him as God. Neither were they thankful. We heard a good lesson about being thankful to God this morning. One of the reasons we have to be thankful to God, not in Thanksgiving as a holiday, but simply in our lives, we have to be thankful to God, for that is the right response to make to God. We have to look at God and say, I want to thank you for all that you do for me. And when we cease to do that, we move away from God. It says these people knew God, but they didn't honor him as God, and they didn't give thanks. But they became futile in their reasonings, and their senseless hearts was darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. I want you to think about what that section of Scripture says, what it says about our culture, what it says about the day and time we're living in. He gives you 3 words there that talk to you about the idea of mankind into this situation where it rejects God, it's not thinking about God. He talks about the idea of being futile, being senseless, and being darkened. All 3 of those are key concepts to the idea somebody's going wrong in their thinking. They're futile, that means they're empty. They're senseless, and that literally in the Greek just means they have no understanding. They don't try to understand in the sight of God. They're unable to draw wise conclusions. Or they are darkened. That means their morality has gone dark. The dark light of God is not in them. It's not being used in their hearts and minds. As we look at all of that, let's understand that those are things that God says explain what's gone wrong with certain people. You know, what your understanding is, because they have now this is all in that Romans chapter 1 section. This is Paul writing back in the first century with what he was observing among men. Because they have cut their ties with their belief system in God. And I'm going to tell you tonight, this can happen to you, and it can happen to your children. They could go away to college and they could cut ties with God. They could lose their faith. Those kind of things can happen. When that happens, Paul said there are certain consequences to this. He will explain to you the consequences. At verse 24, he said, therefore, he's going to say the same thing 3 times, a little different way. Paul says, verse 24, therefore God gave them up to vile impurity in the lust of their heart. They have been given over to something. Do you see that? Do you see what he's saying there? They're being given over to a way of life and a way of thinking. God gave them up. And then at verse 26 says, therefore God gave them over to degrading passions. Think about that. The idea that they're being given over to degrading passions. Now, what does that mean? It means that, well, you kind of got to back up. It said, for this reason God gave them over to degrading passages, because they refuse to retain God in their mind, because they don't want that connection. This is what's going to happen to them. They will be degraded as a result. We will be degraded if we cut loose from God. We'll be no better off. We'll all have that same ending. And then the next thing he says, Paul says, the third time he makes the same comment, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things that are not proper. Now think about that saying. Why would Paul say in one quick text in Romans 1, why would he keep saying God gave them over? You know, there is a strong force behind that word. You know, I think about the fact that, number one, God never says to anybody, you better obey me or I'll kill you right now. He never acts that way. God only encourages us to do better. And then this tells us a little something about as we make the choice to walk away from God, he's making the point that God gave them over. That is a very powerful, strong Greek word. And it means he's going to turn you over to the power of another. Like the very idea of it turning over to Satan. Just put in his hands. You'll see how that's going to work out. All of those descriptions, to one degree or another, kind of talk to us. I think we all agree about our culture, about the time we're living in. And it's something we all need to think about. Now, hard truth number 3 is that the Bible teaches us that fools have a way of being carried away with their own thinking. That is, they have a tendency to worship their own thought process. They kind of think they're the end story of all things. You see that in that same context of Proverbs chapter 1. He says, professing themselves to be wise. Think about that. They think they're wise, but they became fools. They've turned over to an unwise state of life. They profess they are wise. They think they're wise. They think they're smart. They think they're very educated, but they are becoming fools on the side of God because it's leading them to accept other things. Proverbs chapter 12, verse 15 says this, that in support of this point I'm making. The way of a fool is he examines things in life. He thinks he's right in his own eyes. You know, a wise man would accept counsel. He'll go and listen to God. But a fool thinks he's always right. It's in love with its own wisdom. You know, Proverbs 16, verse 12 talks about, Proverbs 26, verse 12. It says, do you see a man that's wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him. Do you see that just makes it very plain? You know, there's not much you can do for a fellow like that. You only can try to teach him, hope they'll be better. But foolishness is a bad, bad end for mankind. You know, the fool never wants anybody telling them, you're wrong, you're right and I'm wrong. He never wants to say that. Nobody likes to hear that anyway, but the fool's especially bad about that. Because a fool is part of his problem is he thinks he's a self-sufficient God. He kind of sees himself as his own source of authority for right and wrong. Do you agree with me that that's where we are right now in our world? Where we're coming to? I would want you to understand that that's exactly right. Dr. George Barna, you've probably seen him quoted before about different kinds of research. Dr. George Barna has done research for a number of years, and he did a survey of 2,275 different Americans, asking them a question. And the question was pretty simple. How do you decide what's right or wrong? How can you make up your decision? How can I be certain what's right or wrong? Can I show you what's wrong right now in our country? What's gone so terribly wrong? First off, he gave them 3 choices. The first choice is, you'll know it in your heart. You'll just look into your heart. Well, Disney has been trying to teach us that for years and accept that as the standard. Our majority rule, I think our government actually wants us to believe that if we say so, that's the end of the story. Our majority will decide, and that's how we know if something's right and wrong. But that's a pretty poor choice. Then the third thing is, what about the Bible? What about what it teaches in the Bible? Let me tell you the answers to those. 42% of Americans said you can know what's right or wrong by what you know in your heart, what you see in your heart. That means they totally misunderstand the standard. They don't look to God for that answer. Secondly, some said, only 29% said the majority rule. Now that's a lesser amount, but the simple fact is it's still not very good. That means a third of our countrymen actually believe that we just need to vote it in. You just need to see what most people want, that's what it's going to turn out to be. And we understand that is never going to be the right answer. That's never going to be the proper answer. But when it comes to the question of how do you decide right and wrong, in Barna's research, he found that only 29%, if you want to know what's wrong with America right now, this is the answer. Only 29% believe that the Bible has that answer. If we wonder what's gone wrong, that's what's gone wrong. If we wonder why morality seems to be increasing, that's what's gone wrong. So many people are not looking to the Bible. They're looking at themselves. They're looking to their own heart and things like that. His conclusion was this research indicates people now are far more likely to take their clues from the government's view of morality and their own hearts than with Bible policies. That's a dangerous situation. That's a dangerous conclusion. Okay, here's the fourth hard truth about fools. Fools, we are told in the Bible, they make a mock at sin. That is a strong statement. Fools mock at sin. Fools have nothing but scorn for anybody who would say to them, your behavior is wrong or corrupt or sinful. Matter of fact, what they mock is the whole idea that anything could be sinful. They don't even look at life that way. That is what our differences are. Fools scoff and scorn at the idea that there's moral law that governs how we ought to live, that tells us how to behave. The New Living Translation said, fools make fun of guilt. They don't like the idea of the guilt. They don't want you to talk about you're guilty of anything. Fools make fun of guilt. Well, that passage is right, even translated that way. They would mock, they would make fun at the idea that people would have something called guilt. They would say, don't feel that way about it. Or the contemporary English version says, fools don't care if they're wrong. They don't care if they have violated something and it offends anybody. That doesn't bother them. Can I tell you something? Sometimes there's a problem deeper with people that are turning away from God. Sometimes people are mad. Sometimes they're mad because their parents raised them a certain way or treated them a certain way in growing up. Some people are mad because their employers have acted a certain way to them. Some people are mad at life in general. They're just not happy about things. They don't like the way it's turned out for them. Can I tell you something? Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 9 makes a statement. It says, be quick in your spirit. Do not be quick in your spirit to become angry. Listen to it now. For anger resides in the bosom of fools. Anger is part of a fool's problem. They are full of anger. They are full of, being mad at the world. They mock at sin. They mock at all things like that. In other words, anger has settled in their heart, and that colors all they see or do in life and how they view God and what they understand about life. They don't look at things the way most of us do. Okay, here's the fifth big hard truth for our foolish friends. They corrupt others by their talk. The things they say will be a corruption for others. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 2 says, the tongue of the wise makes knowledge acceptable, but the mouth of the fool, he's over there spouting folly. We have other passages like this, and Proverbs chapter 13, verse 20 talks about the fact, he said, he who walks with wise men will be wise, but if you become a companion to a fool, if you do a lot of listening to them, you will not gain knowledge from their speech. You're not going to hear anything that's going to help you. By the way, as that text goes on, it talks about how fools are so open to a treacherous kind of deceit. It's kind of like, in other words, their foolish ways have already ruined their lives, and if we're not careful, they'll ruin our lives. We'll be drawn into it. That's what he's warning us about. Remember, Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, or 14, verse 2, talks about fools despise wisdom and instruction. These things will not work in the sight of God. Fools hate that kind of thing. Fools despise the very idea of listening to what God has to say. That's what we have to be careful about. I just think about some of the other words. We don't have much time for that this evening, but I think about some of the things that Proverbs said. You remember in Proverbs chapter 1 where he's kind of talking to his son, and he says, my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. And that's the beginning of a long passage that talks about, please don't get involved with their wicked behavior. Don't let them drag you into their wicked ways. It goes on and on. Sometimes when we talk about them corrupting people, there's kind of two different ways that they corrupt. We go back to Romans chapter 1, and it was talking about the idea that when they didn't see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to depravity to do things that weren't proper anymore, that weren't good for them to live that way. Here's some of the things he's going to be talking about. Starting at verse 29, he talks about how these kind of things could influence our culture. They will be filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, they're slanderers, they're haters of God, they're insolent, they're arrogant, they're boastful, they're inventors of evil, they're disobedient to parents, they're without understanding, they're untrustworthy, they're unloving, and they are unmerciful. All of these things will infect our society when people become fools. That's what starts them happening. When you go a little down in that text, about verse 32, he goes on to say this: though they know the ordinance of God, those who practice such things are worthy of death. They not only do those things, some of them do something else. This is so true of our culture. They give hearty approval to their ways, to their practices. They give approval to it. They either influence them by their examples, or they just tell them they're all right in that condition. And that's what's going on in our world today. That's what we all understand. All right, here's our last mark of a hard truth for fools. Fools don't have the capability in their heart to stop and think there's going to be a judgment day someday. That's one of those important things we all have to believe and we all have to understand. You know, Proverbs chapter 22 at verse 12 makes an observation. Now, this isn't about the judgment day, it's just life in general. It says, a prudent man sees the evil. A prudent man can tell something bad's going on here. I shouldn't be getting involved with this. That's what a prudent man does. He hides himself from it. But a simple-minded man, a man who doesn't think carefully about God's laws and what he says, he goes right on. He passes right on. And he's going to suffer as a result of it. What that's saying is a fool doesn't see the trouble that he's headed for. He can't see and look at that. Do y'all remember a song we remember from years gone by, really years gone by? But it is actually a line attributed to Alexander Pope. It was, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Now that may sound like the line of a song, and it's because it was a song. It was actually Frank Sinatra's song first, and then Elvis recorded it later. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. That is, fools can rush themselves into something that God's heaven would know this is not a good thing. It would be so challenging to go right on. The angel might be more powerful, more strong, yet a fool will rush into it. That's the whole point of it. I was looking at that song the other day, trying to remind myself all that it says, and it says what a fool would likely say. You know, that song is really about falling in love with a questionable woman and how she might lead you astray and everything. But it says this, later in the verses, it says, though I see the danger, if there's any chance for me, I don't care. That's what the fool says. I see the dangers. I see how this could go wrong. But if there's any chance that I can get away with this and do what I want to do, I don't care. I don't care what's going to happen. That's what a fool thinks. That's how a fool thinks. You know, we covered a little bit earlier Proverbs 28, verse 26, but we didn't entirely finish it. That was the one that says, one who trusts in his own heart is a fool. That's a good comment, good thing to think about. But it goes on to say, but the one who walks wisely, he will flee to safety. He thinks about how do you escape, how do you get yourself out of this. The mark of a fool is they don't think about that. They don't see that danger. They don't look at themselves and say, I better get away from this. I wonder how many Christians are fools in that way. Don't let themselves be warned of God. Do you remember that Jesus talked about in his parables in Luke chapter 12, around verse 19 through 20? He's talking about a man. It's a great parable. It's very vivid. He speaks of a man who grew very prosperous and accomplished great things. He was a farmer. What they had in that day, an agricultural guy. He had so much success, he said to himself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take it easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. Do you see any accountability to God in that view? He's not thinking that way. That's why he's called a fool. But it's very interesting how Jesus tells the parable. He says, but God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you've been prepared, whose will they be? The things that you prepare, how's that going to turn out? Fools are thinking about living their lives, and sometimes, yeah, I guess that's good advice, but they're talking about enjoying their pleasures. And the fool is never looking at their life. And I want to ask yourself a very poignant question this evening, because I don't think you're a fool, but I want you to think about it. Are you ever looking at your life when you go to bed at night? You're fixing to say prayers maybe with your wife or your children. Do you ever sit back and say, this night my soul shall be required of me? How often do you stop and think, this may be my last night? This may be the night that I have to give an account before God. This night my soul will be required of me. That's a pretty potent thought, pretty strong thing for us all to go home and think about. I think we'd be different people if we spent a little more time saying, this night may be my last night. This night my soul may be required of me. I may have to this very day give answer to God. Maybe I shouldn't be such a fool. Maybe I should be thinking about that. And a good person is going to think carefully about that. Fools spend too much time doing what they want to do, but they're not thinking about, this night my soul shall be required of you. Now, let's draw this to a conclusion, and let's think back over the points that we've covered, the 6 points that we've made. And let's rephrase this. What can you learn from this lesson so as not to be a fool? I don't want you to be a fool. I don't want to be a fool. I don't want to fall prey to a fool. What can we do to do better than a fool? Well, here's what I draw from the lesson. Number one, I would just ask you to pledge it in your heart that you make your decision to do this. The very first thing is, I will not reject God. I will learn to trust Him for all that I do and make Him the center of my life that way. I will not reject God, for fools are rejecting God and their knowledge of God, and they're not taking it seriously. Secondly, I will honor and be thankful to God. Remember, we read about the culture, so they were neither thankful, neither did they honor God like they should have. I will choose to honor and thank God so that He will never have to look at Pat Jones and say, I'm giving him over to a depraved mind. For God said, I'll do it if you draw away from me. This can happen to you if this is how you go. The third thing I would say we all need to pledge, I'm not going to trust my own heart. I'm going to let God do the direction in my life. I will not trust me. I will trust God. I'll let Him tell me how to live my life. The fourth thing is, I will not ever mock the concept of sin. I'm never going to look at it and laugh at it or joke about it or anything like that. But I will always be open to godly counsel. I will deal with the concepts of sin and guilt. I'll take it seriously. I will take sin seriously. The fifth thing I want you to pledge in your heart is, I'm going to be real careful about ever talking foolishly. Because sometimes foolish talk can corrupt others. It can lead others to believe that they're okay in their sins, they're choosing the right course. I don't want to do that. Be very careful about how you talk so that you don't talk so foolishly that you corrupt somebody else. And the sixth and last thing I want you to know, something you need to pledge in your heart. I will keep this thought in my mind. This night, my soul may be required of me. Am I living with that in mind? This day may be my last day. This night, my soul may be required of me. I don't know how you feel about it. I never think that God has truly abandoned the fools of this world, even when we're acting foolish. So God's given such serious warnings. God really takes this seriously, and He really did in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 1 deals with the idea of God's effort. He did this study. This is the way he explains it in Proverbs 1. It's kind of an interesting way. In verse 20 and 21, it says, "Wisdom shouts in the streets. She lifts her voice in the square. At the head of the noisy streets, she's crying out. At the entrance of the gates of the city, she's uttering her sayings. Now that's pretty interesting. When I was in college, I wanted to earn enough money to pay for an engagement ring because I wanted to get engaged to that girl sitting up here. That was my decision, and I wasn't going to go home and beg for them to give me money to get an engagement ring. So I went down and I got a job at a grocery store, and I did extra hours anytime I could to make the money for that. I worked until I could make that money, and then I bought her that ring. That's what I did. But during that time, I learned quite a bit about working out in the public. And when I was doing that, one day in that grocery store, a lady came in. She was an older lady. There was an older apartment complex where a lot of older people lived right behind that store. And some of them would come over right there to shop. She clearly was a lady afflicted with what we'd call Alzheimer's today. Her mind was gone. She was terribly confused. I know how she feels. It's a bad situation to be in. Sometimes we feel terribly confused, don't we? But I thought about her. She was wandering around the store. She was muttering the whole time. She was saying things like, I thought my daughter was going to be here. Where's my daughter? Where is she? And I walked up to that lady and I said, can there some way or another I can help you? And she didn't respond great one way or the other. It wasn't anything I could really do for her. I went to my boss and I said, this lady's very confused. Is there anything we could do for her? And he didn't want to get involved with it. And I thought about that woman a lot through the years, and I thought about the fact that she was getting older, she was getting confused. I felt bad for her. But one thing about her, when I watched her walking through the store, she was talking and getting no attention whatsoever. People weren't taking her seriously. Even my boss didn't take her very seriously. And I thought about this woman. Of course, that's not the woman there. But I thought about this lady I've got up there, and I thought about she's older, and maybe we don't take her very seriously because she's not young anymore and all of that. So we're looking at her, and we're thinking about wisdom is like that. Imagine wisdom that way. That's what Solomon is saying. Wisdom is of such a nature that wisdom's like a woman out there, and in their culture back there, they didn't take women as seriously as we feel like we should today. But in their culture, the woman is out there in the streets saying things, and nobody listens. Wisdom's in the streets crying out, in the gates, uttering things. You know, I thought about that lady. There was something about her situation that felt very desperate, very uneasy. And I thought about what she was trying to say and what she was trying to tell us. Now, this is not what she said, obviously, but it's interesting. This is what Solomon says is being said. The woman of wisdom, she's out there in the streets, and she don't seem like she fits. He mentions that the streets are noisy, and everybody's, loud and boisterous and everything. She says something to all. She says, how long, O naive ones, will you love simplicity? And scoffers will delight themselves in their scoffing, and fools hate knowledge. Please turn to my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit upon you. I will make my words known to you. Did you notice there she mentions 3 different kind of fools, basically, that Proverbs addresses? Talks about the naive that are caught up in loving their simplicity. So that kind of simplicity kind of fits the idea of open-mindedness, where you don't take anything in life as really solid truth. I'm open to everything. It's kind of the idea behind it. That's a naive person. They're believing everything. Then she mentions the scoffers who make fun of truth, the scoffers who laugh at the idea of spirituality. They take such delight in their scoffing. Are the fools that hate God's knowledge, and they don't want to be educated by that. We've got plenty of those kind of people in this day and time. Well, Proverbs chapter 1, verse 24, it goes on to say a couple of more things I want you to hear before I draw it to a close. Wisdom is still speaking, and wisdom says this, and please take this seriously, because this is God basically saying, this is true of wisdom. This is true of my wisdom. God says, because I called, you refused. I stretched out my hand, and you didn't pay attention. You neglected all my counsel. You didn't want me to reprove you. You didn't want me to say anything about it. He says, because of that, I'm going to laugh at your calamity. I'm going to mock when the dread comes upon you. God's saying, basically, this isn't going to end well. Just like the end of Judah didn't end well. The end of Israel didn't end well. Verse 28 and 29 says then they will call on me. They'll know, finally, I should have been listening. But he says, they will call on me, and I'm not going to answer. I'm not going to talk with them about it. They'll seek me diligently, but they're not going to find me. Because when they could have, they hated knowledge, and they did not choose the fear of the Lord. That ought to make you just simply shake in your boots to know that God is thinking that God is saying, if it gets to that status, I'll just let you go. I'll let you go. I'll give you over, as we said 3 times in the book of Romans. This is what's going to happen to you. You didn't choose what you could have chose. I tried to talk to you about this, and you wouldn't listen. You'll try to find me at that time, and you didn't like knowledge. You didn't want to be educated by my wisdom. You didn't choose the fear of the Lord. I'm asking you tonight, young or old, if you're sitting here listening to me, choose the fear of the Lord. Understand how valuable this is, how much this ought to affect your life, how important it ought to become to you. I encourage you to choose the fear of the Lord, and as we're looking at and thinking about the invitation of the Lord Jesus Christ, whosoever will may come, may I say to you tonight, please choose the fear of the Lord. Choose a relationship with God. Choose to live your life in accordance with the wisdom of God. These things matter. It'll make a difference in your life. Choose the right things before it's everlastingly too late. We really want to encourage you to listen to the gospel and to obey the gospel. And if we can do anything for you to help you go the right direction in life, we encourage you to do that while we stand and sing the song of invitation together.